Hi, everyone. This is Tom.
Hi, I'm Amelia. Get the gallery. There's the gallery view, right? How is everybody out there? It is beautiful here today in Dayton.
It is really gorgeous.
Sunny day. We would really rather be out at the pool, but we're glad to be with you and bring you yet another wonderful story from the Gospel of Mark.
Right.
What chapter are we in? Are we in 5, Tom?
We're in time 5, yes.
5. Okay, all right. So Tom will tell us the story. This is a little bit longer one. It's actually 2 stories. You get 2 for the price of 1 today. So here we go.
So this is the story. When Jesus had crossed again in the boat to the other side, a great crowd gathered around him, and he was beside the sea. Then a ruler, a leader of the synagogue in that town, came and fell at Jesus' feet. His name was Jairus. And he begged and begged him that he might come. And he said, "Rabbi, my little girl is at the point of death. Would you please come and lay your hands on her so that she might be made well and could start to live?" So Jesus went with him, and a large crowd followed him, and they were pressing in on him. Well, in the crowd, there was a woman who had had a flow of blood for 12 years. And she had spent everything that she had. She had suffered much under many physicians. She wasn't getting better, but was getting worse. And hearing the reports about Jesus, she came up behind him in the crowd, and she reached out and she touched his cloak. For she had said to herself, if I could even just touch his garment, I will be made well. And immediately, the bleeding stopped, and she knew in her body that she had been healed of this scourge. Jesus, sensing that power had gone forth from him, turned around in the crowd and said, "Who touched my garments?" His disciples said, "Rabbi, you see this crowd pressing in on you, and you ask, 'Who touched me?'" But he continued to look around for who had done it. So the woman, immediately, knowing what had happened to her, came with fear and trembling and fell at his feet and told him the whole truth. But Jesus said to her, "Ah, my daughter, your faith has saved you. Go in peace and be healed of this scourge." Well, while he was still talking to her, they came from the house of the ruler of the synagogue. And they said to him, "Your daughter is dead. Why trouble the teacher anymore?" Jesus, sensing and hearing what they were saying, said to Jairus, don't be afraid, only believe. And he wouldn't allow anyone else to go with him. But he went with Jairus and took with him Peter and James and John, the brother of James. When they came to the leader's home, they saw and heard a great tumult of weeping, wailing. And when he went into the house, he said to those who were there, why are you weeping and wailing like this? The girl is not dead, but sleeping. And they laughed at him. But putting all of them out of the house, he took with him the father of the girl and her mother, and those who were with him. And he went into the room where she was. He went over and he took her by the hand. And he said to her, Talitha cum. And that means, little girl, I say to you, rise, get up. And immediately she got up and she started walking around the room because she was 12 years old. And her mother and her father were overwhelmed with joy. They were ecstatic. And Jesus told them over and over to say nothing about this to anyone. And then he suggested that they might give her something to eat. That's the story.
Yeah. I love the way that story ends. That little detail about giving her something to eat just feels so normal, doesn't it?
Yeah, it's really delightful. There's so many things about this story that are just so.
Well, going back to the beginning, we get introduced to a new character. I guess this is the only place in the gospel where Jairus comes into play, but feels like he's significant. He's named, and he's a leader of the synagogue.
Right.
So he's an important person.
Yeah. And he's the only one of these various characters who is named. Now, the other is Bartimaeus, who is named at the beginning of his story. But this is unusual for a person who's asking Jesus' help to be named.
Yeah.
It shows a degree of memory that is associated with this story.
This story, yeah.
Yeah.
Hearing you tell at this time about his little daughter being near death. I mean, I've heard the story a lot. I read it. It really struck me because I'm a mother, with a daughter, and two daughters actually. I love very much, and what it would be like if one of them, as children, had been close to death. What that would feel like. I didn't really want to get too close to those feelings while I was trying to do this video, but it's a powerful story, a very emotional story of parental love.
Yeah.
And so Jairus comes and asks Jesus to come help him.
Yeah.
And then that story gets interrupted by another story about this woman. You said, did you say flow of blood?
Yes.
That was her problem.
Yeah.
And sometimes I think it's called a hemorrhage.
Yeah.
And apparently it was something that was ongoing. It couldn't stop. It wasn't like a monthly cycle or something.
Right.
But why is that such, and you actually called it a scourge.
Yeah.
I think I've usually seen affliction, but you used a very strong word, so why would you use such a strong word? Well, I guess constantly losing blood would not be a good thing. I don't like the association that maybe a menstrual cycle is a terrible thing, but an ongoing one would be
all the time,
weak all the time. And
right.
I guess, and also in that culture, it would mean they would consider you unclean, right?
Right. She was ostracized. She was probably isolated, and that, so that she was free to come up in the crowd because she didn't have any place else to go. That, and that she couldn't do it openly. She had to do it in secret. So I wanted to, tell this story quietly because it's her experience. It's her description of her own internal life and of what she was doing in doing this. And the word, I translated as scourge because that's what the basic word in Greek, mastigos, means. It means a whip or a scourge. It was a word that was used for, when they would scourge somebody. And they'd take off their shirt and whip them with this scourge that had, 12 leather strips and then sometimes with metal tips at the end of them. So that scourge is an appropriate word for, and it's used twice. So Mark is doing this intentionally. And I think it's a better translation than affliction or sickness.
Well, it's definitely a much stronger word. And, kind of confirms that stronger word is that she'd spent all her money, right? She spent everything she had trying to be relieved from this scourge. So, she's really in a desperate situation.
Yep.
And she turns to Jesus.
Right.
Yeah. So Jesus actually touches her, is that correct? Or she touches him?
She touches him.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And he senses power going out of him.
Right.
That's interesting.
Well, it's a reflection of the understanding of energy flow, so on, energy passing from one to another, and that she could, just by touching his garment, by touching his cloak, that she could tap into his energy. And so the implication is then that this is a sign of his special character, his divinity, but that he had this magnetic power about him. So it does reflect an unusual character of who he is.
But Jesus doesn't get angry with her after all, she's a woman, he's a man, he's a rabbi, she's an unclean person. There are a lot of reasons why, kind of in a normal situation, he would have every right to be angry with her, but he's not.
Very. No, it would, for a woman to make a man unclean like that without his consent was a major offense. And so she knew that, and that's why she was afraid and was shaking when she came and told him the whole truth. And I was interested in there was a commentary, Joel Marcus commentary, says, it's like in a trial. You swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. That's the vow that each witness is to take, holding your hand on the Bible. The whole truth. So she told him she was under trial. And she thought that she was going to be condemned. And rightly so. But Jesus doesn't pay any attention to the law. He's quite comfortable with being one who would say, hey, what happened here was great. So, don't be afraid. And, I'm not offended. what you did was terrific. You saved yourself. So go in peace and be healed of this scourge. So it's a kind of freedom that Jesus had that is reflected in the story.
Yeah, yeah. There's a lot of things in this story with the woman that are relevant to our spiritual lives too. That, if we go symbolically, it's just hard for me not to think about that. When you were talking about her touching him, the sense of stay in touch with Jesus. She's literally in touch with Jesus. And
right.
So when you're going through something that's really difficult or ongoing affliction and ongoing scourge, yes, stay in touch with Jesus.
Right.
And then also the disciples say, how can you tell somebody touched you? Look at this huge crowd. That even in the midst of all the concerns that are going on, and we all, sometimes we feel like, well, there's so many big, huge problems in the world. My little problems is
pressing in on.
Yeah, pressing. Yeah,
that's how that feels,
Right? Can Jesus care about my little individual issue? And he did. He paid attention to that. Right. So, so she's, and then that she is healed.
Yep.
And that he accepts her and calls her daughter, right?
Yes, my daughter.
My daughter.
Yeah, so she's got a new family.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so, yeah, it's an extraordinary. He heals her both in public, in terms of her public position, as well as what was happening in her body. Right. So her body got healed, but then he gave her dignity,
right,
and honor. Right. Rather than humiliation and further
shame. Right.
Shame.
Yeah.
Right.
And shame is such a driver of so many bad things. So yeah. Okay, so then we have a return to the story of Jairus and his little daughter.
Right. And while Jesus was doing all this and talking to this woman, his daughter had died.
Yeah.
So there's a sense of, forget all that, go to the house.
Right. Is there a connection? Marcus does this in other places where he has a story. I call them sandwich story.
Yeah.
Where there's a story, might also call it a wraparound story or something. You have a story inside a story. And usually Mark's got some reason for doing that. Is there an obvious, or maybe a not so obvious connection between the two stories that you could enlighten us about?
Well, I don't know. We'll see. There is an interesting thing. She had had a flow of blood for 12 years, and the girl was 12 years old. So
right, not 10, but 12, right?
Right. Yeah. And so her life began at the same time that this problem was that the woman had. Began at the same time. And so, and there's an interesting phrase at the beginning of this that Jairus says, that lay your hands on her so that she might be well and start to live, is the literal translation of the words there. And so his implication is that he wants his daughter to have a new lease on life, to be able to start over again and have a new life. So
so that makes me wonder, was this an awakening story that she really was asleep and he kind of, woke her up in some sense? Or is this a resurrection story that she had died and he brought her back to life? Or don't we know?
Well, there are similarities between this story and the story of Lazarus. Jesus waits, and so she dies. But then, in this story, Jesus says she isn't dead, she's just sleeping. So you got to take, in this case, I'd say you take Jesus' word for it as to what was the situation, that he wasn't raising her, but that people thought she was dead. And so when he said, she's just sleeping, they laughed at him. And it's interesting, this is one of those really short cola in the gospel. They laughed at him. So Mark really emphasizes that. But Jesus isn't even intimidated by that. It doesn't matter if people laugh at him. So he goes in and takes her by the hand.
Yeah. And she sits up, I gather. She walks around the room.
Immediately, she got up, started walking around the room. So she wasn't a little baby girl.
Right.
She was a 12-year-old girl.
Now, the words that Jesus says to her, well, obviously they're not English. I mean, but they're not Greek either. I mean,
they're Aramaic.
Aramaic, right? Why would he? What's that little detail about? And also, did you, in your kind of narrating, say which means da 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 da, or is that Mark? Did Mark actually say this means da 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 da?
Mark says that.
Okay, and if so, why? What's the significance of that?
Those words are Aramaic, and the probability is that Jesus spoke Aramaic, and that the rest of the story is being told in Greek because that's the language that the audiences of Mark understood, but that this gives a kind of authenticity to this story, that he remembers the exact words, the exact sounds that Jesus said, Talitha, cum, in Aramaic. And then Mark translates story, which means, little girl, get up. But it gives that kind of authenticity to the story, that is to hear those exact words. That's also characteristic of some forms of magic, where you learn a magical formula, like Harry Potter has his various things that, he has to say the exact words in order for the spell, to happen. Well, this has a little bit of that feel to it, that these exact words were things that then would be remembered.
Yeah. Okay, so we have two healing stories, both women or females. One's a woman, and the other one's is a young girl. Or
well, she's
12, so she's
on the verge of being a woman.
Yeah, right, on the verge of being a woman, especially in that culture. How historically likely is that Jesus actually did these healings?
Well, there are people who are quite skeptical about these kind of miracles. These two stories have a ring of authenticity about them in terms of their memory. The name of Jairus, the detail of what he said to her, of the woman, and of Jesus breaking the law. In both instances, he is, by not condemning the woman, but rather accepting her touching him, and then by his touching what everybody thought was a dead body. He wasn't concerned about that at all. So Jesus demonstrates a degree of freedom from the law that is extraordinary for a rabbi. But he does it for the sake of these two female, one older woman and one young woman. So he lays his reputation on the line for the sake of these two characters.
Yeah, and again, they're women.
Thing.
Yeah, he cares for women as well as men.
Right.
So the two healing stories kind of makes you think of healthcare issues. What would you say would be implications of these stories for our healthcare system today?
Jesus heals everybody. So the implication is universal health care for everybody, regardless of their status. So this woman was unclean. She was one who would not be acceptable in any context. Jesus heals her. Mm-hmm. And the girl, for him to take her by the hand was itself controversial then and now. Mm-hmm. Jesus heals everybody who asks. So the implication is that healthcare is to be divided and be withheld from no one, but that it is always, that it's a right, and that Jesus did that. And among the figures of the ancient world, Jesus heals more people and is more of a medical person in relation to healing people than any other character in the ancient world. And it generated then the healthcare system that we currently have. Many of the hospitals were started by followers of Jesus. That was the case, right down the street from us at Good Sam Hospital, where I was born. It was named after the story of the Good Samaritan, but it was formed by an order of Roman Catholic nuns. And that's been the case, with Methodist Hospital in Indianapolis and, all over the country.
Christ Hospital.
Presbyterian hospitals and Methodist hospitals and Catholic hospitals. So this story, these healing stories have been profoundly generative. And so their being told in turn generates a motion of social action for the establishment of healthcare to make healthcare available to everybody in the world.
Okay. There you have it. Universal healthcare and staying in touch with Jesus for your spiritual and healing, which all of us need at one time or another as well. So thanks for being with us today. Have a good week.
Have a good week.
Right.
Be healed.
Bye.
Yeah.
Be
Go
healed.
in peace.
Be sons and daughters
right.
of God. Yeah. Family of Jesus.